Welcome back to the Marvel Movie Minute, a daily podcast in which we explore the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe 1 minute at a time. In this, our 5th season, we are looking at Joe Johnston's 2011 film, Captain America, The First Avenger. I'm Andy Nelson from the Next Reel Film Podcast.
And I'm Pete Wright from Fondue and You.
Today, we are talking about Minute 78, which begins with Private Lorraine getting up close and personal, and ends with Stark telling Steve he's working to keep Steve and his men from getting killed. Back on the show today, we have Jason Dittmer, author of Captain America and the Nationalist superhero. Welcome back, Jason.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
We are coming in on a hot and heavy moment between Private Lorraine and Steve as she grabs him and pulls him back by his tie out of view of everybody else so she can lay one on him. This is Steve's acting like this is kind of his first kiss. How does this play for you? Does it work?
Well, you know.
I mean,
if you heard our minute yesterday, you know our thoughts on the
it's fine. It's kind of like it just, once again, every micro move in this minute is in this sort of sequence, this exchange is so broad. Like the fact that they're kissing and then they're interrupted and Steve turns and like wipes his mouth off, and it's just like all kind of gross and too broad strokes for me. So I'm all about the kissing. Don't get me wrong. You give me a good kissing scene any day, but it's just it's played for cheapness, and I'm not crazy about it.
I mean, isn't it kind of broad and cheesy and a bit awkward? Exactly what first kisses are supposed to be, right? They're never the cinematic. The music swells, their lips gently touch and glisten. It's I think for most of us, our first kiss was probably something horrific that we would never want to have on film.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I would agree, though, that the scene.
It's very ridiculous.
Sorry, I forgot this is the Lothario minute. But I think it's it's not a great scene, but as we said in the previous episode, I think it serves a purpose in the plot, and it fulfills
utility
that.
Minute.
Yeah, it's
exactly.
getting us from here to there is really what's happening with the scene. Again, with what we learned in She-Hulk, it's like I really struggle that he is acting this way. And obviously they didn't know where later projects were going to, kind of take his character arc and stuff. I would guess the way that it's playing here is that likely Chris Evans, Joe Johnston, the writers, everybody was kind of leaning on the fact that this likely is his first kiss. Like, it feels like they're playing it that way. It doesn't feel like this is a guy who's been, hanging out for months with all the USO dancers as they travel around the country and the world. This does feel very much like it's designed to be a first kiss. And so it's interesting that it's set up that way. I mean, Steve does, he doesn't pull away from it. He does put his hands on her waist and he is fully accepting once things get going before Peggy does interrupt. Unlike you, Pete, I do find the interruption actually quite funny when she very kind of sharply says captain and they break the kiss so suddenly. I actually think that plays pretty well, and maybe it's because of how quickly Steve throws himself backwards away from from Private Lorraine. Like, it's pretty comical, and so to that end, that moment I think is fun.
Well, and to lean in on your, I think both of you, your collective defense of the moment yesterday, as feeble as I think it was, I do think that all of that setup that I find too broad leads to one very important exchange, which is right now after the kiss, which is, you don't know a damn thing about women, do you? Like, you haven't learned a thing. Well, of course he's not. He just had his first kiss. But we have to, like, this moment of reminding us, the audience, that he is still tiny Steve in at least some way, shape, or form, like tiny, inexperienced, naive Steve, who's just kind of fumbling around, even though he's wearing the shell of this impressive, like, dominating masculine figure, is, I think, an important note for the origin story of Captain America. He still has a lot to learn.
Yeah. TVtropes.org lists this kiss as the forceful kiss trope.
Is that even the forceful kiss trope?
Yeah, it's when you're being pushed into a kiss that you weren't expecting or perhaps wanting.
Is it like in Aliens when the little mouth
That is the
punches through the back of the head
forcefulest
of the...
kiss. Yeah, that's the one.
Very forceful. Yeah, right. No kidding.
I mean, I think there's something about the kind of dialogue about how he doesn't, there's a line in there that I think is quite interesting where she says, "You're just like all the others now. You wanted to be a soldier and now you're just like them." And I think that's an interesting line. It kind of does a lot of work, both because he's clearly not like all the other soldiers, right? I mean, he's Captain America. But she's kind of putting him into that pile, right? If in the previous episode or 2 episodes ago, we were talking about how, his power and his kind of charisma and his looks and everything kind of make him the center of everything. And she's kind of saying, you're not the center of everything. You're just like everyone else. And at the same time, what she's really doing also is implying that part of the reason she was attracted to him was for that kind of moral fortitude that, is so central to the character of Captain America. And she sees this break of his discipline as a kind of weakness, right? That makes him less desirable, right? So it's interesting because I think it's kind of playing with his character and kind of setting the boundaries of what's acceptable for him.
Well, and I think it's even more interesting in that light to look at her and the choices they made for her around her dress, like what she's wearing, because we talked 2 minutes ago about the value, the cultural value in the scene of the red dress as she was, to use your term, peacocking. And here we've put her in like her practical, just white blouse, plain dress. There is no moniker of rank on her at all, right? She is just here a woman, but she is not in the big showy red dress, which to my eye means that she or makes her more sort of vulnerable as a woman to this kind of slight, given what we've seen of their relationship in the last 2 minutes, and also that sort of allows her to demonstrate the practical center of power in the scene, right? She has been slighted, but she is still an authority in their relationship, and I think it's a great choice not to put her in a uniform, traditional uniform. For that reason,
it keeps it from like there's still a balance of Agent Carter and Steve Rogers, but it doesn't feel like she's just the militaristic like person who's in this particular scene. She feels like she's the human who's in this scene,
right?
And that works in context of the way they're playing it. TV Tropes does list this part of the film as the woman scorned trope, so they just it's amazing how many tropes you find in a project. And of course, we get the return of fonduing, as Pete brought up. This is where Steve tries to throw a retort at her. She caught him in a kiss with Private Lorraine, and so now he's trying to use it on her by accusing her of fonduing with Howard Stark. We had seen the fonduing bit play out a little bit up on the plane as they were taking him to jump over the factory. And here we have the return of it. Does fonduing sound like something sexy? Does it sound like, oh, okay, they're doing some kinky bedroom games? Is that how does that read for the two of you if you don't know what it is?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this in the airplane scene when they had the first time fonduing came up, and I think I'm pretty sure I landed on, I don't think I think he's really that obtuse not to know what fondue is. But clearly he is, right? We need Howard to explain what fonduing is, bread and cheese.
Not to be super Dorcas here, but I think in the United States, I think fondue was a kind of 1960s phenomenon. And so probably a lot of, especially working class people, wouldn't have known what fondue was in the 1940s.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Just to go
deep
dive on the history. I suppose 70s actually really is more fondue era. Right. I think they missed a trick here because they could have had, Howard kind of giving him because she kind of says, you don't know anything about women. And then it cuts to him doing the fondue line. And really, he could have said something about teaching him the fondues and fondon'ts of women. That's an appropriately long gap between the joke and the laughter.
I'm going to call that Zoom lag.
I assume we can.
The fondues and the fondon'ts.
Fondon'ts.
That would have been perfect. And, coming from Howard A. Stark, that would have been the appropriate person to deliver that.
Right.
I also really think that he should have had a fondue pot just somewhere in the background of his lab when we get in there. Like, how funny would that have been just to have like him obsessed with fondue?
Like a later shawarma joke.
Exactly. There's a short. There is a short that celebrates. I'm sure that celebrates the Stark fascination with fondue.
Come on, Marvel one-shots. Get it out there.
Yeah, we need a one-shot.
All right. Any last thoughts between this moment with Peggy and Steve, or should we jump into the lab?
Lab.
All right. My first note about the lab is, where's Colonel Phillips? Since apparently he was supposed to be meeting with Howard Stark per Private Lorraine, but he's not here. I don't know. Maybe he ran to the bathroom as he was getting ready to head out.
He's just in the back eating fondue,
yeah, that's
just
in the one
shoveling it in.
That's all part of the one shot. Absolutely. But yeah, this is where Howard gives him his response about fondue, so that Steve finally knows what fondue is. It's just a bread and cheese thing, and starts their conversation about women, Stark's perspective of women, and the whole idea of don't think that was your first mistake. Which does feel very tropey in and of itself. This whole thing feels very tropey. This whole moment in the film that we're talking about, it's like trope after trope after trope. I feel like it stumbles a lot because of it. And I mean, as much as I enjoy the characters, I do feel like we're kind of in a place where we're dealing with this kind of this romantic comedy element of the story, and sometimes it just doesn't play as well as other parts. Does it work for either of you?
Well, because you know who could have written this entire scene is John Hughes. Like, this feels right out of a John Hughes movie. Like, we need the nerd and the jock to have an exchange like this, and this is subverted because it's the nerd who is talking about, like, he ends up being the guy who's so much more suave and experienced, but it's still that kind of an exchange.
Yeah, you're right. You could easily imagine it, like, walking away from the football field, one arm around the jock's arm around the nerd, being like, here's what you got to do.
I'll tell you something about women, bud. Yeah.
And to that end, it's interesting that you brought that up, because there is very much a vibe like that in stuff like Cyrano de Bergerac, which has that same sort of thing. Like the beautiful specimen of a man is a complete lunkhead and has no concept as to how to actually like converse with the woman, and requires this person who is less than, because of the way that the story is told, is somebody who has those skills. And of course, Howard, I suppose in context of the story, just being the nerd, he's the one who is that Cyrano sort of character who's helping the lunkhead or just get a better understanding about things. The thing that I like about this is that we're in this lab down here in the Allied headquarters, and this is where it really starts feeling like a precursor to what Q would be doing in the James Bond films. And I can't help but think that he is one of these assistants here. And really, like, the James Bond franchise is really part of the MCU. It's just a totally different branch of it. But it all starts here, and Q gets his mad skills of learning all this crazy science from Howard Stark, seeing how things are done in the lab. At some point, somebody might be shooting a gun in the lab without any other protective gear. I feel like this is exactly what Q fell in love with that we're going to get here at this point.
And there must be something on tropes.com or whatever your website is about this kind of scene too.
Absolutely. I haven't even checked, but yeah, there's definitely a lot. It's Generation Xerox. Howard Stark is a large ham, the Casanova, and an ahead of his time genius. Apparently, these were all genetic traits. Also worthy of note, Howard Stark similarly mentions to Steve that he considered himself more of a workaholic, and his work takes priority over being the Casanova, has people in his lab working on a motorbike, and attempts to ignore the vibranium shield completely. So it's, this whole idea of this guy who is just so ahead of his time, who is doing this lab work and has all of this crazy stuff here and is just playing it off like there's really nothing there. That's essentially the trope that we have here. Mm-hmm. And as that trope mentioned, there is a motorcycle there that might also come into play. So we're setting things up. But there's really not much more to this minute. We kind of end this conversation between the two of them, and we're going to continue it tomorrow. Is there any other thoughts on this minute? I feel like this, there's kind of stuff right before it and right after. This minute is kind of this moment between stretching these two things. Any last thoughts about any of these points here?
Armory and explosives. Is that what it says? Storage. Yeah. So that's what's right behind them. I feel like this is where all of the secrets are, is what's going on in the lab elsewhere. We've talked about the motorcycle, but it feels almost almost a little too generic for a Marvel walk and talk through a lab. Like I want to notice more Easter eggs here, and I don't have them yet.
The only one that I think that we're supposed to notice is the motorcycle. But did you notice something else, Jason?
I didn't see any other Easter eggs either. I mean, I suppose it's too early in a way, isn't it? I mean, because you can't have Easter eggs for the other movies yet because they're all happening several decades in the future. And, they haven't probably even come up with whatever's going to be in Captain America 2 or whatever. So, probably limited possibilities there.
The only thing that I would note is that as they first come in, there's a lab worker working on a machine in the back that's very well lit. Both he and the machine are very well lit, and the dials on it, like I don't think that they had known by this point that Disney was going to swoop in and purchase the entire Marvel franchise. But in the context
like Mickey Mouse.
In the context of Disney, and I don't know if either of you are familiar, but they have things that they call hidden Mickeys all over at their theme parks, where there are little secret Mickey Mouse heads, just the shape of the three circles, all over the place. And it's very fun to kind of track down all the hidden Mickeys when you go there. And that almost looks like it could have been a hidden Mickey back there.
Yeah, it really does. That's funny.
Yeah.
That's funny. It is so intentionally lit. That's the one that made me think, because everything else is just sort of a wash and shadow, except for that. And it could be, what are they making? A bread? It's a bread maker or a juicer or something? Who knows? I kind of delight in wondering what that is.
Yeah.
The only thing I was going to throw in about the scene, and it relates to the previous minute too, is I haven't compared it to other scenes in the movie, because the whole movie is so retro styled, right? But this looks like they ran the film through a sepia filter and then ran it through a sepia filter again. I mean, everything in the scene is like various kinds of golds, brasses, coppers. It's pretty extreme. I mean, and I do wonder if sometimes, I mean, they obviously went for the kind of Rocketeer aesthetic, but sometimes it feels like it takes you out of it, actually, because it's so it's kind of over the top.
Well, to that extent, this was a period early in Marvel's films where they were finding directors who perhaps were allowed a little more flexibility with kind of what they were doing as far as their own styles and stuff. Like, I mean, Kenneth Branagh and the Dutch angles that he brought to Thor, like throughout the entire thing, like it's just constant Dutch angles. And that drove a lot of people nuts because it just felt like it never, like the camera was always tipped. And here it's very much the same thing where it's like, it's always sepia. Did Joe run it through the wrong bath and accidentally stain everything brown when they were processing it? Because it does feel so sepia. But I mean, I think that's also part of the style. And I guess that's something I think some people might miss in later films, the sense that there was this period early before they really started, locking down and really driving Feige's vision more so than the directors, where you did feel like you could have some little differentiation in feel between films. Do you like Joe Johnston as a director, Jason? Do you follow much of his work? I mean, you brought up the Rocketeer. Obviously, that's something that he had done and has that same tone.
I mean, I wouldn't say I'm like a super fan or not. I mean, I liked this movie quite obviously, and I liked the Rocketeer and so on. But I think at some points in this, it feels a little just. I mean, we were talking before about the prevalence of tropes, and it seems to me it's a film that's both trying to be retro, and often tropes, in their original form are so blunt. They become tropes because they're these go-to mechanisms for conveying something, but kind of going back to the 1940s, could mean a lot of different things, right? You could have a little bit of a sepia tone to things and kind of handle things differently, and make the tropes a little less ham-handed, a little less war movie. I mean, war movie tropes are kind of the worst, So, I guess it's a point of critique potentially, but of course, some people obviously like it, and I like the movie. I'm not saying this is a bad movie, but it's one of those things where you look at it now and you kind of think, oh God, it's. There's no color in there that isn't kind of a gold or a brown in the entire room.
Well, I mean, it definitely has a look, definitely has a style. I think that we should just wrap this minute up. Actually, you know what? Since we have a little bit of time, something we do toward the end of the week, but let's just do it today. We talk about favorite Captain America moments. Do you have a moment in any of the films or perhaps one of the comics that you would say is your favorite Captain America moment, Jason?
Oh man, that's like should have prepped me. It's a weird one, but it's one that sticks in my head. And I couldn't tell you. It's from the comics. I think sometime in the 1990s. It's at a stage, in the comics, kind of all the Marvel comics go kind of dark, especially in the 90s and the 2000s and so on. Everything's a conspiracy. The government's behind it, layers and layers of darkness and people getting corrupted. And, so there's a bit about Sharon Carter, who's this kind of long-term romantic relationship in the comics. She's kind of disappeared and, all sorts of horrible things have happened to her and she's become jaded. And, instead of being this kind of the younger sister kind of love interest thing that she is, she becomes this kind of really just tortured character. And in the story, the Red Skull has the cosmic cube, right? Which is the kind of comics version of the Tesseract. And so Captain America's trying to fight and get the cosmic cube from him. And it's all done in this kind of dark colors. And, it's very gritty. And Sharon Carter is helping him. And basically the Red Skull loses the cosmic cube. And for a moment, Captain America catches it. And in that whole page, they drew it like they did in the 1960s, right? So it's like a very clear set of bright colors and clear lines. And he draws Sharon as she was prior to all this stuff happening. It's kind of, to me, a remarkable scene that shows what comics can do because the style of the art matters so much, and so in just a kind of one page, you see how Captain America wishes he could remake the world so that Sharon was what she used to be, but nothing is said. It's all done through the art. And it's kind of a beautiful moment. It's really stuck with me ever since I saw it.
That's fascinating.
You're right. Like, in the history of the comics, they've had so many different artists and styles and storytellers behind them. And it's exciting when it's like when they remember that they like, hey, we could do something. We could actually play with that and integrate it into the story to do something unique that way. So that's awesome.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I think, it's a remarkable medium. And, sometimes they don't do everything with it that they could. They're obviously prisoners of today's style. You can't just draw comics like it's the 1960s anymore because, it would look dated. But for that moment, it was the kind of a perfect thing to do.
That's awesome. That is awesome.
How about you guys? What are your favorite Captain America moments?
I haven't read many of the comics, and so for me, it really does boil down to the films and so many of the big moments, that other people have called out, like when he catches Thor's hammer or the Avengers Assemble moment, things like that. Like I feel like there are a lot in Endgame that really stand out. I feel like one of them for me that I always think back on is not necessarily the moment where he is racing around the the reflecting pool, and and the whole on your left thing. But it's more their conversation afterward when they're just kind of sitting down chatting about stuff, and that to me, like I feel like those are the sorts of moments that you get with Captain America, where you have, just it's a simple conversation with Sam, but just like about the realities of being a soldier and just going and talking to that group and stuff like things like that. I feel they capture in ways that I find surprising sometimes for franchises like this.
I think, these are very sweet and, internal sort of scenes that you guys are talking about. And for me, I'm just going to go the other way and say, before we get started, anybody want to get out? The elevator fight with everybody is amazing. And because it makes a perfect callback later, Hail Hydra is just I love the pairing of those sequences. It's an incredible fight, an incredible exhibition of stunt work and close quarters. So it's really fun.
I totally agree. I think if I had to pick one from the movies, that would be my favorite moment.
That was a fun one. All right. Well, let's wrap things up for today. Jason, remind everybody about you and where they can track down what you're up to.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. I'm the author of a book called Captain America and the Nationalist Superhero, which is available online for purchase, should anyone be so interested. And if you're interested in hearing about British politics or cat pictures or anything of the sort, you can find me on Twitter at RealJDittmer.
A related question. In all of your research for Captain America and the Nationalist Superhero, who's your favorite nationalist superhero? What country has the best nationalist superhero?
Oh, that's a great one. I mean, Captain Britain is in some ways the funniest because, he was created in the 1970s. Basically, Marvel was trying to kind of launch superheroes as a European phenomenon. And so they set up shop in the UK, and they thought, okay, well, we want to bridge into this. So how should we, we need a character that'll relate to the British people. And the person they got to write it, or to, I think he wrote it and drew it, I think was Chris Claremont, on the basis that he had been born in Britain, but he moved away when he was like 2. So he didn't really know anything about Britain.
He's just writing Captain Britain based on the stereotypes in his head.
Yeah, I mean, and it's terrible, and it doesn't do well. I mean, so that's what's funny about it, is that they kind of start him with this like Arthurian legend kind of a thing as the basis of his power, but the British people are like, what? Nobody relates to this, and so like every sort of 10 or 20 issues, they kind of relaunch him. They give him a new origin story. They change his powers. It's a hot mess. And at one point for the book, I interviewed this guy who was currently writing Captain Britain after sort of like 40 years into this. He's never sustained publication, but he keeps popping up in different comics like Excalibur and so on. And I said, do you find any problems with trying to understand this stuff? And he said, yeah, when I joined, they asked me to write Captain Britain, and he went to the keepers of continuity. There's like these people who work at Marvel Comics who have like they maintain the database of like which characters have been in which stories and what are the major events that happen, so that when someone says, I want to write a story with this character, they say, well, this is where he's at currently. Because, of course, he could be appearing in all these different comics. And he says, I went to the Keepers of Continuity, and I said, can you tell me what is the basis for Captain Britain's powers right now? And they said, we don't know. We don't know. So, I think to me, it's a great case study, because it's like this kind of thing where they're trying to latch on to something that's essentially British. But especially if you live over here, you realize there isn't a lot that's essentially British. Everyone argues about everything. It's actually a country of many nations and all competing histories and nationalisms and all kinds of things. And so, that's I think my favorite one to study. It's just funny.
That is funny. Where do you draw the line in deciding who is kind of the nationalist superhero for any particular country? Because I know there was also the Union Jack, who we've kind of touched on very briefly through Falsworth here in this film. But would he fall into that or?
There's no great way to define a nationalist superhero. So I will tell you, he is in the book. I talk about him. I talk about Captain Britain. They're actually two. Speaking of this problem of kind of speaking to Britishness, of course, Captain Britain was a lord, right? He was a lord who had a manor house and everything. And everyone in Britain was like, thumbs down, we hate rich people and so on. And so then Union Jack was introduced in the 1970s at the same time in The Invaders, right? So The Invaders was this retro World War II story written in the 1970s. And he's the kind of working class character in contemporary days. So when they write him back in World War II, he's a lord as well. But in Union Jack comics, he becomes this working class version. So you get different versions of kind of Britishness being put forward by these different characters. But the practical answer to your question is, I basically said whoever, you had to kind of represent the country. Preferably you would have some version of like the flag in your uniform, or your name would refer to the country, but in the end, it was kind of whatever I thought seemed relevant. The one hard and fast rule was I was never going to include Superman, even though in many ways he meets the definition, but who has time to read them all? Because it took me like a decade to read all the Captain Americas. And there's way more Superman than there are Captain America.
He's an alien anyway.
I thought, yep, my definition ends there.
Alien.
Interesting.
So
Interesting.
anyway, it was practical decisions,
absolutely.
shall we say.
I don't know much about Captain Britain at all, but my only understanding is, and the thing that makes it funny to me hearing you talk about it is in the Lego Marvel Superheroes game, Captain Britain has a British flag Mini Cooper. And I don't think that's comic canon, but it slays me to watch that interact with that car.
Maybe he's actually Austin Powers
Cooper.
and it's the same person. Wow. All right. Well, check that book out. You can get all sorts of interesting facts and tidbits in there. And we'll be back tomorrow to talk about Minute 79. So thank you, Jason. And Pete, thanks as always.
Andy, I think you could play a nationalist superhero.
Until next time, true believers.
Do it.
Marvel Movie Minute is a production of True Story FM. Engineering by Andy Nelson. This season's music is Spread the News by Anthony Vega. And this season's show art is by Winston Yabo. Find the show at truestory.fm, and if your podcast app allows ratings and reviews, consider doing that for this show.